it. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Erin McClintock, that some of you have already probably attended some of our presentations at EVERFI or some of the events and conferences that we participate in. Erin is a strength-based mental health counselor who has spent the majority of her career in the field of collegiate psychology and well-being, both as a clinician and as a former director of wellness and prevention at Clark University. As EVERFI's mental health subject matter expert, Erin critically explores the issues of mental health and well-being and their intersectionality with sexual assault, substance abuse, diversity, and inclusion. Erin holds a graduate degree in mental health counseling and completed her postmaster's education in trauma and addiction studies. I think we could have not possibly thought of a better person today to present on the topic, and I am incredibly excited to hear her talk. So without further ado, Erin, can you hear us? If you can, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michele. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you just type into the chat box if you can? Great.
I can hear you great.
Well, good afternoon.
For what it's worth.
Super. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this webinar. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you that are coming in from the West Coast. As Michele mentioned, my name is Erin McClintock, and I am fortunate enough to be Director of Prevention Education for EVERFI and the Campus Prevention Network. As Michele also mentioned, the majority of my work here at EVERFI really focuses on mental health and well-being, and particularly the way that issues like sexualized violence, alcohol and other drugs, and diversity and inclusion impact the well-being of college students. I joined EVERFI a few years ago after spending the bulk of my career on a campus, first as a counselor in a counseling center where I dealt directly with responding to the mental health needs of students, and then as Director of Wellness and Prevention Education, where I had the opportunity to work more upstream, focusing on health promotion, particularly in the three areas that we're going to talk about today. In both roles, I had the opportunity to work closely with athletics offices and athletic staff, as well as student athletes, and it's something I've always had an affinity for. So this particular presentation has a special soft spot for me. In the spirit of that, we've developed this session to truly hone in on the unique needs and behaviors that exist within the student athlete population, particularly as it relates to best practices for prevention and response in terms of how to reach them. We're going to start off today by looking at the three critical issues that we're highlighting and take a look at some available data that exists around student athletes specifically. Then we're going to spend some time exploring some of the connections that exist between sexual assault, alcohol and other drugs, and mental health. Third, and this is what I'm really excited about, we're going to explore some recommendations for how to best engage athletes in wellness and prevention efforts. Finally, we're going to spend a few minutes looking at some of the preliminary data that we've gleaned through our sexual assault prevention for student athletes course and what ongoing implications that might have for your work with students on campus. One of the things that we know, and one of the things that we thought a lot about in creating this session, was the fact that all too often at our institutions, the issues of substance use, of sexualized violence, of mental health can sometimes exist in silos. You have your violence prevention coordinators, you have your Title IX officers, you have your AOD coordinators, your counseling centers, your athletic staff, your athletics coaches. And sometimes, aside from sitting on committees together or seeing one another at social gatherings, depending on the size of your institution and the resources that you have and how busy you are, sometimes there's not a lot of collaboration that exists between these entities. And sometimes there's not a lot of data sharing. Since these are three of the most important issues that are facing college students today, it's important to note that student athletes are no different. So today we're going to spend some time looking at the impact that these three issues have on student athletes specifically, and the ways in which institutions can support them collaboratively through both prevention and response efforts. Before we dive specifically into the data that exists around student athletes and these issues, it's really important to first explore some of the unique needs that student athletes face. Now, much like any other specific student group or specialized student group, there are unique challenges and strengths that exist within the student-athlete community. First, they often balance multiple identities within their team, within their friend groups, within their families, within their major or vocation. Sometimes this involves code switching or feeling like you need to be one way in front of one group and one way in front of another. And it can also sometimes pose some challenges, especially if there's conflicts that exist between one or more aspects of your identity, which can bring about challenges in a variety of ways from a substance use standpoint and from a mental health standpoint. There's also a heightened focus on physical being. For the student athlete, their body is often the tool that enables or detracts from their success on the field. From a well-being standpoint, of course, we know that this can have both positive and negative implications. On the positive side, from a prevention standpoint, prevention efforts that focus on the negative impact that risky behaviors have on athletic performance might resonate more with a student athlete than with a non-student athlete. But on the extreme side, certain sports have more of a propensity for mental health issues like eating disorders or body image issues, given the importance that's placed on body mass. Student athletes, like most students, but often to an even greater degree, have a variety of relationships that need balancing, and this can be related to some of the time sacrifices that they have to make. For a student athlete to be successful, especially if they're competing at a really high level, they need to be astute at being able to balance the many obligations that they have. Students on the whole are especially time crunched, and student athletes even more so. Student athletes are also in the position of managing others' perceptions of them and of their sport. In some institutions, athletes can be perceived as being put on a pedestal, or may have a heightened sense of expectations placed on them by other students, by faculty members, even by those that mean well. At other institutions, student athletes can be ostracized in other ways. For example, at the school that I was at before coming to EVERFI, student athletes in many cases weren't widely accepted by their peers. And many of the peers had negative connotations of what student athletes were and of athletic culture. And because of this, the student athletes in that community were very insulated. Finally, the influence of the sport of choice can pose both challenges and strengths from a well-being standpoint. As we dive in a little bit more to some of the data that I'm going to share, we'll see instances where data is actually indicating that higher rates of risky behavior exist among certain sports, where other sports have much lower rates. It's important to think about all of this in totality as we're developing best practice recommendations to support the unique needs of our learners. So we're going to start off today by talking about substance use. When we think about substance use, alcohol is in many ways the most commonly cited issue as it relates to the student-athlete culture. And for years, institutions have looked at the topic of high-risk drinking or binge drinking, particularly as it relates to high-risk events like athletic games. Alcohol plays a role in athletic culture in two ways, both with the fans who tailgate at events that contribute to high-risk drinking and with the student-athletes themselves. One of the things that we also know is the ways in which student-athletes impact the community in which they play their sport. Many times, student-athletes play a critical role in prevention efforts because they're representatives of the community with a direct connection to the topic of health and wellness. Before we dive into athlete-specific data, I wanted to share some numbers at the outset that explore trends that we're seeing in student drinking overall. So this is some data from Monitoring the Future, which is a study of 12th grade students. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going into college, just 12th grade students overall. And these are numbers that show the amount of students that have not consumed alcohol in the past year. So what we see clearly is that this is going up. More and more students are choosing not to consume alcohol. When we look at alcohol EDU data, we see similar trends. So among first-year students who took alcohol EDU over the past 10 years, we see an increase in students that are coming in as non-drinkers. At the same time, the rates of students who are drinking in a high-risk way are going down, both in Monitoring the Future data and in alcohol EDU data. I always bring this up because it certainly bodes the question, what is it that we're doing as individuals working on college campuses to recognize these trends and to speak to the fact that most students coming into our communities want to be a part of a healthy community and are engaging in behaviors that we would deem to be healthy. how are the programs, policies, and procedures that we put in place helping to keep students in that non-drinker category? And also, how are the messages that we send supporting that? So that's something I want everyone to think about and hold on to as we go through this presentation. When it comes to speaking about student athletes specifically, we see similar trends. So when we think about student athletes, we often hear about the negative: initiation, binge drinking, drinking in a high-risk way. But when we look at data, we see a different story. Since 2005, drinking rates have actually gone down for student athletes, with 63% of males and 41% of females engaging in high-risk drinking in 2005, but only 44% and 33% in 2014. And whenever we look at a data point, it's also crucial to look at the story that isn't being told. And in this case, that's the story of the healthy majority. Because even though 44% and 33% of students are drinking in a high-risk way, which is higher than the national average, when we flip the data, we see another story. And that is that 67% of female students and 56% of male students, so the majority, are not drinking in a high-risk way. So while it's important to consider the high-risk drinkers in our prevention efforts, because of course we want to make them a healthier part of our community, it's just as, if not more important, to think about the ways in which we're reaching this majority of students who are not drinking in a high-risk way. What can we be doing to empower them to stay in that category? Social norms campaigns, which we'll talk about in just a bit, can be one way of doing this. There are also some additional considerations to keep in mind when exploring substance use and how it relates to student athletes. First, this first point, student athletes have been found to be less likely than their peers to engage in social drug use. For instance, 22% of student athletes reported past year marijuana use compared to 33% of all students. Among all athletics divisions, D3 athletes report higher usage rates than students in Division I and Division II schools, including a more dramatic increase in marijuana from 2013 to 2017. So even within, we speak about student athletes generally, but it's important to also consider the fact that there's different patterns that exist within different divisions, within different sports, and even within your institution itself. When we look at substance use, lacrosse players, both men and women, report the highest rates of substance use, and this is an aggregate number, while men's basketball players report the lowest. From a stimulant standpoint, 7.5% of student athletes report using stimulants without a prescription in the past year. And in 2013, 5.8% of students reported using narcotic pain medication without a prescription. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is the opioid crisis. And of course, it's important to pay attention to because it's something that's impacting the world on a national level. But when it comes to college students, what we've actually found is that college students are more likely to misuse stimulants than they are to misuse opiates. So as we're tailoring and thinking about, one, what students have access to, and two, the ways that we're impacting them from a prevention standpoint, it's really that stimulants are the things that we need to focus on. And finally, one of the points that I wanted to highlight today is that while smoking has declined overall, chewing tobacco remains a concern. The numbers of students who acknowledge that they use chewing tobacco really haven't changed in recent years, and this is especially true among certain sports. For instance, 13% of male student athletes report using chewing tobacco, with the greatest prevalence being students who play baseball, lacrosse, ice hockey, and wrestling. So as we're thinking about asking questions, for example, in the medical setting, one of the questions that we often ask is, do you smoke? If a student's using chewing tobacco, they may not say that they do. But if we make that a question, do you use chewing tobacco, that might open up an opportunity to have a dialogue about that behavior. So now let's shift gears and look at another critical issue that impacts our students, including student athletes, and that is sexualized violence. As most of you, if not all of you, I'm sure everyone on this phone call already knows, in the wake of increased media attention and heightened expectations, the NCAA has put forth a policy that's designed to hold schools accountable. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because I'm hopeful that it's something everyone's pretty familiar with, but really wanted to just highlight that the NCAA is doing something really groundbreaking here. The overarching principles of this policy require that athletics be fully knowledgeable about policies, and processes, that they have to review the recommendations of the NCAA Violence Prevention Toolkit, which is a really well done document that I've highly recommended ongoing reading following this webinar if you haven't had the chance to look through it, and that they utilize their platform to serve as campus leaders and take a stand to support prevention initiatives. This is a crucial time, and while we wish that these initiatives happen sooner, this is a prime opportunity if you're working in a prevention space to nurture relationships with your athletics community on your campus, and if you represent athletics on your campus, to begin to develop relationships with those who are working in the prevention space. This also ties in heavily with what we're going to discuss in just a bit, which is the Campus Prevention Network Framework for Comprehensive Prevention. I also wanted to just highlight a little bit about legislation that exists. So the NCAA policy has really raised the bar on what's expected of institutions. Title IX, which everyone knows about, states that responsible employees must receive training. The Clery Act says that schools must put forth a good faith effort to train students, staff, and faculty each year. The NCAA policy is much more explicit and requires commitment from the president, Title IX coordinator, and athletics director to attest that training has been delivered annually. That's 3 people who have to have their names and signatures sign off that certain trainings have taken place. So moving on to data and student athletes, particularly as it relates to sexualized violence, what does data tell us about student athletes? Well, there are a few things that we know for sure, and certainly a few areas of growth that can take place. First, on a national level, nearly 70% of student athletes feel that they have a responsibility to prevent sexual assault at their school. This data points twofold, right? How do we empower that 67% to act? And how do we get the 32% that don't feel this way or care to become more engaged? And additionally, despite 67% feeling that they have a responsibility to prevent sexual assault, only 27% of athletes would take action in a situation where someone was trying to take sexual advantage of another. So thinking about the perception that many students overall have of student athletes on campus and their role as leaders, it's worth exploring what we can be doing from an educational standpoint to empower our student athletes to own their place as leaders and feel empowered and confident to take action when it's appropriate and safe to do so. I had the opportunity this year to attend the Biden Courage Awards in New York City, and one of the students who was honored for brave recognition of having been a really powerful bystander was a student athlete who essentially stepped in and intervened in a situation where a female student was being sexually assaulted. This student athlete actually ended up getting followed out of the party that he intervened at and shot twice, which obviously is not a picture-perfect example of how to intervene, but it was such a powerful example of, the support that was surrounding him in the aftermath of that incident, for him to be able to step up and do that. From an engagement standpoint, moving into our second pillar here, according to data from our sexual assault diagnostic inventory, which is something that's free on the CPN website, which I'll have a link to at the end, this assesses an institution's overall prevention efforts. And one of the things that we learned from that is that only about half of schools have athletics as part of their working groups around sexual assault prevention. This is really an interesting statistic for me because there would seem to be so much more of an opportunity for collaboration in that space. So again, I'll say to you, if you're on the webinar and you're a prevention person and you don't have athletics having a seat at your table for wellness efforts, please invite them. And if you're an athletics staff member and you're not having a seat at the table for prevention, please find a way to get there because there's so much synergy and it's just such an important thing to have happen. When it comes to the number of schools that are specifically targeting student athletes, on a positive side, almost 3/4 of schools are. And I have a feeling that as the NCAA policy really ramps up and every school is adopting it, that these numbers are going to go up even more. And finally, from an opportunity standpoint, there exists some clear opportunities where we can focus our efforts on student athletes. So some of the data that I'm sharing is from Haven, which is our sexual assault course. And what we found is that only half of student athletes that were surveyed in Haven felt that their peers would refrain from sexual contact if another student was incapacitated. At the same time, 61% answer affirmatively to the statement, a person who has been drinking and sexually assaulted is never at fault for what happened to them. So while it's good that the majority of athletes answer this question in the affirmative, it is slightly concerning that there are still 40% who disagree with this statement. This is higher than the average among non-athletes and further validates the notion that student athletes sometimes tend to be more likely to buy into rape myth acceptance. As we consider the role that athletes play in prevention efforts, it's important to consider that that role can be very dynamic. We do know that statistically speaking, student athletes tend to be more likely to buy into rape acceptance myths and beliefs than non-athletes that are surveyed, and engage in significantly higher levels of sexual coercion than the general student population. We see media coverage that talks about hazing on sports teams, that discusses the experiences of college athletes who were sexually assaulted by their classmates and those that sexually assaulted their classmates, and some instances where those students are defended by the schools. But what research in the mainstream media also tells us is that athletes can be survivors too, and often are. Look at, for instance, what happened with the USA gymnastics team and the wave of athletes that have come out in the wake of Me Too. I remember when Allie Raisman gave her victim impact statement, I was sitting in a hotel room at the National, and I was struck by how the structure of USA gymnastics in so many ways mirrored an institution. You know, she talked about senior leaders turning a blind eye and policies, procedures, and programs needing to be put in place to ensure that what happened to her would never happen to someone again. At the core of our prevention efforts has to be a threefold plan. First, doing what we need to do to create communities where rape myth acceptance are not tolerated, where victim blaming language does not happen, and where students are educated in a way that's congruent with their values. Second, we need to understand that student athletes are often survivors too, and have an increased awareness of the ways in which an assault can impact their identity, both as athletes and as students. And third, we need to create a space to engage student athletes as allies and empower them to use their leadership on campus in a positive way, particularly empowering that healthy majority that we talked about. It's also important to note that these issues don't just relate to varsity athletes. Since students that engage in intramural sports don't typically fall under the purview of the NCAA, some schools overlook them as athletic teams, which means that they don't get access to the mandated trainings that varsity sports teams would. Implications around sexual assault and substance use exist among intramural sports just as much as they do among NCAA athletic teams. Participation in organized recreational and intramural club sports has been shown to be a significant predictor of total heavy drinking. Students participating in intramural sports use alcohol at a greater frequency and intensity than non-participants. And they consume more drinks per week, have higher typical and peak blood alcohol content, and tend to have more negative consequences, all of which may be due to more frequent participation in drinking games. Campus administrators are in a unique position to create policy and education that can positively impact team members' behavior. Determining how and whether athletes on intramural teams are engaging with risky alcohol use is a really important first step in identifying where athlete prevention resources should be directed. I could go on and on about this, of course, but it's really important to explore what protocols your institutions have in place among intramural sports, if any, because some don't. Do policies exist? Do you have outreach or the capacity to outreach to intramurals? Is there someone who's overseeing intramural sports, and can they be involved in developing some sort of protocol to support these students to the same degree that we're supporting our varsity athletes? As we know, this is a high-risk group. Finally, let's spend a little bit of time looking at student mental health and some specific implications that exist both from a prevention standpoint and from a response standpoint around this issue. Just as there are a variety of implications and considerations for student athlete well-being, there are unique impacts that affect student athletes differently from a mental health standpoint. Student athletes, like any other specialized population, require institutions to collect data that speaks specifically to what those needs are. So it's really important, while I'm highlighting aggregate data that nationally exists, for you to spend some time thinking about your own institution and what the data would say about your institution specifically. While athletics is a unique culture of their own, these are still college students. And so like any other student, they're not immune to the developmental stages that students go through, to things like adjustment, biological factors, predisposition to mental health issues. And like other specialized groups, however, there's a certain cultural competency that's required of professionals that are working with them, especially when it comes to a counseling setting. We have access to some mental health data that speaks to the specific presentation of student athletes. And here's what we found. First, 24% of student athletes surveyed presented with clinical symptoms of depression. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're seeking help. This just means that when screened in a national study, 24% spoke in a way or answered questions in a way that was indicative of clinical symptoms of depression. Recent data from our EVERFI course has found something really interesting, and that is that nearly a quarter of college student athletes report having experienced bullying related to body size or body image. We know this can have significant mental health implications, particularly if someone is already predisposed to behaviors that may lead to an eating disorder. A 2017 study of student athletes found that nearly 10% of students that were screened for mental health conditions presented with a moderate or severe need to seek services for suicide prevention. This doesn't necessarily mean that they sought those services, but that they needed to seek them out. And of further note, suicide is the fourth leading cause of death among student athletes, following traumatic injury, cardiovascular issues, and homicide. What's more, female athletes tend to be, at least outwardly, more impacted by mental health than male athletes. Studies have shown that females experience depression at higher rates, with the highest rates of depression being among female track and field athletes. And again, this is national data. Collect this data for your own institution as appropriate. In terms of reaching out, D1 women's basketball reported the lowest comfort in reaching out. And additionally, female rates of injury are also higher, and this includes concussion, which we know through emerging research has connections to mental health. Additionally, in our data on bullying, we found that overall, nearly twice as many female student athletes report experiencing bullying than male athletes do. And that 1/5 of those students report that they experienced bullying prior to coming to their institution. So as we're thinking about how to reach these students from a response standpoint and how to be present with them when they come in for a therapeutic session, it's important to take into totality all of this information. On the whole, student athletes are less likely to seek help for mental health conditions. Let's explore what some of those barriers might be and some strategies potentially for working through them. For all students, as we know, there are barriers to seeking mental health treatment, and the systems and policies that our institutions have in place can either support those barriers or reduce them. Some of the common barriers to seeking treatment for student athletes include stigma, whether it's self-stigma or stigma about how someone else will perceive a decision to seek help. Sometimes it comes down to a lack of awareness about available resources or about procedures for accessing those resources. Perceptions can also be a barrier. This could be perceptions or fear about how they'll be perceived, or perceptions about how they'll be treated differently if they choose to seek help. Another very real barrier for the student athlete is time and schedule. Often if we think about the schedule of a student athlete, they may have class all day, and then they may have practice either in the mornings or in the afternoons or evenings after class. And if a counseling center is operating on a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 schedule, this can just sometimes not be accessible for a student athlete to get services. Additionally, if they're referred off campus, they may not have access to a vehicle or transportation to get them there. Additionally, athletics at many institutions is an in-group. And if there are not counselors or helping professionals that are relatable or a part of that in-group or have a connection to that in-group, it can be hard for athletes to feel like that person will get them, so that they'll connect. And finally, there can exist concerns about the confidential nature of services. And this can be especially true, we found, at Division I schools, or schools where student athletes are in the limelight a lot and maybe preparing themselves for careers in sports following their education. So we've covered a lot of data, and now it's time to shift gears and look at what can we do about it. What can we do to look at these issues in totality and to work in both making helping resources more available and making health promoting resources more widely adopted? Through the course of the decades of research and work that we've done in this field at EVERFI, we've developed a framework through a rigorous review of the available literature and best practice recommendations that speaks to what comprehensive prevention can look like. We use this model, the Framework for Comprehensive Prevention, to explore the comprehensive approach that institutions and organizations can take to ensure that their prevention efforts are successful. At the base of the pyramid, we have institutionalization, and this is the foundation of any truly powerful prevention effort. Institutionalization refers to the degree of system-wide buy-in, visible commitment, and meaningful investment in efforts. It's really about resources, leadership, and having people across the system making a commitment to the issues that matter. Next, we have critical processes. This is really about the process of collecting and utilizing data in a deliberate, strategic, and research-informed way, as well as evaluating our efforts. Institution and critical processes lead to policy, which really is just the values and expectations of our community and the ways in which we uphold them. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, we have programming. These are the direct outputs of our efforts and really the way in which we deliver messages to maximize impact. Sometimes when we think about prevention, the first thing that comes to people's mind is programming. And while that's a really important aspect, it's only as good as the institutionalization, critical processes, and policies that are behind it to make it sustainable. All four of these elements exist in unison and really build off of one another to support efforts in each domain. And a truly effective well-being practice is going to embody excellence in each of these domains. So let's take a look at what this framework can look like when we apply it specifically to our work with student athletes. First, at the base of the pyramid, we have institutionalization. From an institutionalization standpoint, it's really important to ensure that there are collaborative relationships between athletics and those who are responsible for well-being on our campuses. Each entity knows something that the other doesn't. And the ability to collaborate can be a really powerful one, not just for students, but for the professionals that are doing the work. One of my most positive relationships when I worked on a campus was with our athletics office, because I learned a ton from them and hopefully they learned a lot from me. One of the most important things that a prevention professional can do when working to get student athletes on board is connect with coaches. Obviously, depending on the size of your institution and the scope of your athletic program, this may be easier for some than others. But one strategy for doing this is to think about what that carrot would be for the athletic staff or for the coach and why they should care about prevention efforts. Coaches, of course, care about the well-being of their student athletes, so that can be an important angle if you're a prevention professional trying to engage them in your efforts. This also ties into other aspects of strategies that we'll share, and it really applies to all topics: sexual violence, substance use, mental health. And if you are a coach, consider ways that you can make space for prevention and wellness professionals at your table. Invite them to a meeting, grab a cup of coffee, and see how you can collaborate. Or if you haven't already been asked, to my point earlier, ask them for a seat at their table, because I'm sure that there's a welcome one for you. Coaches and those working in leadership positions within athletics are in a tremendously influential position. They're often looked to as role models, and the coach-athlete relationship is a really powerful one. In conducting a wellness campaign, particularly one that might challenge misperceptions about well-being or behavior, it's critical that coaches are on board and speaking a message that's aligned with the broader institutional message on well-being. So going back to my point earlier about the majority of students coming in as non-drinkers, it's important to think about how the individuals who are working at our institution are either supporting that or taking away from it, because students often aren't aware of that. If you find discrepancies between how much students are drinking and how much they think other students are drinking, that's a perfect opportunity for education, conversation. But if coaches are normalizing drinking, then it can have a negative impact on the efforts to change behavior to begin with. Another interesting thought in the institutionalization realm, to my point about time and availability, is to consider having a wellness person embedded within the primary hub of athletics. There are some athletic centers that actually have a staff counselor from the counseling center come over one day a week at hours that work best for student athletes, with appointments reserved solely for those athletes. By forging relationships, you can begin to explore what that might look like at your institution. And finally, at the core, institutionalization is about resources and commitment. Ensure that there are funds allocated to well-being. We know that funds exist for basic safety equipment, for helmets, for uniforms, for first aid kits, for AEDs. But what about funds that are designed to support prevention? Work with athletics, or if you're from athletics, explore your budget to see where there might be room to allocate some additional funds towards wellness and health promotion. From a policy angle, there are some basic things that many schools are already doing that can be incredibly important for supporting student well-being. First, you can consider making mental health screening a part of your preseason physical. Students are used to having to have their medical needs checked out before starting a season or when they get injured. So why should mental health be any different? A simple screening assessment could be a great place to start to help students understand whether or not they're at risk for certain mental health issues. It can be a confidential process. It can be coordinated through your counseling center. Coaches, staff, no one has to know about it. It's just an opportunity to start to normalize the topic of talking about mental health and provide students with some insight into issues that may impact them. Second, consider developing a protocol for mental health referrals. Say, for instance, a coach is concerned about a player. What should they do? Is there some sort of formal procedure in place that allows them to refer that student to counseling or provide a warm handoff with someone they have a relationship with in the counseling setting? What about if a student athlete is concerned about a peer or another student athlete? By being transparent about processes related to this, you can ensure that when the time comes to implement such a policy, you don't have to rush. So that when a student comes into your office and is in crisis, you'll know exactly what to do. And that student will know exactly what's expected and will eliminate some of those barriers. Along the same vein, be sure that confidentiality and expectations around confidentiality are clearly communicated. Make sure that students know who on campus is confidential, who isn't, and per the NCAA recommendations, that certain policies are clear and easily accessible. Our course, for instance, allows schools to customize and add their own policies and resources to make that easy. Finally, consider establishing a policy, if you don't already have one, for students who experience or are perceived to have experienced a concussion, including psychoeducation around what to look for from a mental health standpoint, as well as potentially a referral to a counselor for follow-up as needed. Even if the student doesn't use it right away, it can help establish a relationship that they can go back to should the time come. From a critical processes standpoint, first, it's so important, in the spirit of everything we've talked about today, to collect athlete-specific data. This is so important both to develop prevention efforts and in getting a better sense of what's happening within your institution. This can be done as outlined in the last recommendation in a variety of ways. You could conduct an athlete-specific climate survey. You could ask questions via an online course like EVERFI. You could do brief assessments at the beginning of the season and throughout, or through surveys that are developed in conjunction with an institutional research team if you have one. Figure out what it is that you want to measure, what you hope to accomplish, and use that to tailor questions that get to the root of the issue. Or you could consider putting together a climate survey or climate questions that are specifically for student athletes. If data is something that's totally unfamiliar to you or intimidating, as it is for many people, and I totally get that, I just put a blog out on our CPN website that you're welcome to check out, and that could be a really great place to start. It's called How to Become a Data Guru, and I'm happy to send it along in a follow-up email. Once you've collected data, and once you've developed a sense of what your institutional athletes need, put together a document or some sort of a plan to outline the priority items that you want to tackle, as well as how you're going to accomplish that. It doesn't have to be major. You don't have to boil the ocean. It can be one or two things that you want to spend time focusing on over the season or over the year. Think about who else needs to be in the conversation and what specific skills or resources athletes and coaches will need to make that happen. Finally, once you've taken the time to collect data, make sure that you share it. This is especially true in instances where misperceptions might exist. From the social norms world, and my colleague Alan Berkowitz says this and I love it, it isn't about what a student would do, it's about what a student thinks another student would do that determines whether or not they'll act. So even if a student isn't personally comfortable drinking, if their perception is that all of their peers drink, they're more likely to engage in that behavior because it is part of what they believe about the community. It's so critical that these gaps are addressed and that they're called out when they're discovered. Finally, from a programming standpoint, as with any group, it's really important that we tailor the data that we're collecting to the interests, needs, and beliefs of the people that we're trying to reach. Meet them where they are, speak their language. Make sure that you're offering programs during time slots that work around practices, around games, and or consider ways to integrate well-being initiatives into already existing athletic times. Consider providing training that's based on skill. Student athletes are used to taking direction and having specific takeaways that they can practice. So consider that as you're building your efforts, even more so than you would with other student populations. And finally, back into the institutionalization piece, obtain buy-in from coaches, or if you are the coach, work with prevention professionals so that you can ensure that the way that you're messaging and talking about issues is consistent. When I was on a campus, I'll share a little story. We did something that's a really good example, I think, of what can happen when all of these things come together. So as an institution, our athletic staff noticed some data that indicated that some of our athletes may benefit from some additional education on substance use and how to support a friend who might be struggling. So myself and a colleague of mine, another therapist in the counseling center, we developed an hour-long training that covered 4 key areas. First was understanding the specific impact that alcohol and substances had on athletic performance. The second was to learn about the stages of substance use, abuse, and addiction and how to recognize them. And finally, it was identifying skills for how to support a friend or team member that you were concerned about and how to seek help if you felt like you needed it. This worked out really well because we had tremendous buy-in from the athletic director, coaches made the training mandatory, and blocked off time for their players to attend. We spent an hour with each athletic team talking about the issues, and this ended up serving a couple of purposes. First, it demonstrated that their well-being was an issue that was important to the institution and to their coaches, and to one another. Second, it provided a place for athletes to talk about substance use and to challenge within a private, safe group setting some of the misperceptions that within each group firsthand, and promoted some really interesting dialogue. Third, it allowed them to spend time with counselors on campus and realize that we got it, which ultimately increased their comfort in reaching out. They now had 2 faces that they recognized that they could say, okay, I met these counselors outside of the counseling setting, and they're safe if I need to talk to them. We conducted some pre and post surveys that yielded some really positive feedback from the student athletes, and we provided the coaches with that data to use for follow-up. We also provided coaches and athletic staff with some ongoing talking points so that they could continue the positive messaging for their athletes. It was a really great experience and something that is easily duplicated on any campus. It's also important to remember that there are resources to support your work. Our Campus Prevention Network, for instance, through which this framework was developed, is one such example. So the link is up here, and on our website, you can find completely free resources in all of the domains that we covered today. You can also take our sexual assault diagnostic inventories and our alcohol diagnostic inventories, which are two completely free assessments that benchmark your efforts against best practice as well as against other institutions. The NCAA is another great resource to support your ongoing efforts. A lot of the data that I pulled today was from the NCAA and surveys that they've put out. They've also put together a really great toolkit, as I mentioned, to support institutions in their sexual assault prevention efforts. Speaking of sexual assault prevention efforts, in the short time that we have left, I wanted to just spend a minute talking about our EVERFI athletics program. We've developed a course for student athletes and a course for athletic staff designed to meet the requirements of the NCAA mandate and designed to be aligned with the NCAA toolkit. The course is fully customizable and covers the issue of sexual assault prevention from a bystander standpoint and from a personal standpoint. You can add your own welcome and closing letters. You can embed appropriate resources and policies for your institution. You can put images, videos, as well as your school logos. So it really feels like your institution created the course. One of my favorite features of the course, in the spirit of all the critical processes that we talked about today, is the ability to ask questions and get that baseline sense of your student athletes' experiences, behaviors, and beliefs. I wanted to share with you some of the preliminary data that we have from the course. It hasn't been out for a terribly long time, but we've already seen a demonstrated impact that we're really proud of. So remember when I talked about perception and the importance of students having accurate depictions? Here are some great examples. So from the course, students have seen an increase in their ability to intervene and a confidence in doing so. There's also been an increase in the degree to which students believe their peers would intervene. So back to my point about it not being about what a student would do, it's about what their peers would do. Here's a great example of what can happen when that changes. Students have seen an increase in their awareness of support services, an increase in knowing how to report a sexual assault, a decrease in their likelihood to endorse certain gender stereotypes, which, tying back to my point about being bullying, is a really powerful thing. There's been an increase in students who believe that a survivor is not to blame, and there's also been an increase in the degree to which students believe that their peers would not engage in sex if the other person was drunk. So that's all that I have for today. I know that, Michaela, I'm going to turn it back over to you for a couple of housekeeping things while I spend a minute or two looking through the questions that may have come up. And we've got about 10 minutes left that we can answer them in.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was an outstanding presentation. I'd like to thank you for presenting on this topic today. And before we jump into questions, I'd like to just launch a short poll just to see if folks would be interesting to learn a little more about what we have here at EVERFI to help in prevention training for athletics. So if you're familiar with our courses, please press no. If, on the other hand, you'd be curious to see what our athletic-specific training suite looks like, please type in yes, and we'll be sure to have someone reach out to you and show you around our platform. I'm going to leave this open just a couple more seconds for folks to vote. And I'd also like at this point to quickly mention a few housekeeping items before we jump back into questions and then Erin brings us to a close. Again, I'd like to say that all of the attendees on the call today will receive a copy of the slide and a copy of the recording and a follow-up email. And if you would like to ask questions, please do so. You can still do so in the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. Erin will try to answer your queries if she can. If not, we will try to get back to you on an individual basis. Lastly, if you're staying with us for the questions, great. But if you're logging off, you'll notice that a short poll will initiate that will ask you about the quality of this event today. If you could take 2 to 3 times to put it in, 2 to 3 minutes, apologize, to fill it in and give us your feedback on the presentation. That is very helpful and is very much appreciated. So we had about 60% of the people vote. Thank you very much for that on the poll. I'm gonna close it out, and then Erin, are you ready with the questions?
I am. Thank you, Michaela. We have a couple of questions that I'm hopeful we can get through. And then any other questions, as we mentioned, if I'm not able to answer right now, I'm going to follow up with each one via email to make sure that we are able to address them all. One question that came up, yeah, thank you. So one question that came up, can you talk more about the sexual assault diagnostic inventory and the alcohol diagnostic inventory? Yes, happy to. So these are two assessments that we've developed through the Campus Prevention Network, because one of the things that we noticed was that there was a lot out there that was designed to evaluate the ways in which institutions were responding to sexual assault or responding to alcohol issues, but not so much designed to evaluate how institutions were supporting their efforts from a prevention standpoint. So similarly to our process for developing the CPN framework, we pored over the available research, and we were able to come up with some very distinct recommendations that spoke to what best practice from a prevention standpoint looks like. Through that, we developed these two assessments. The Sexual Assault Diagnostic Inventory, really designed to look at programming, critical processes, and institutionalization, asking questions about your efforts in that space. So the way that it works is the school will sign on to the Campus Prevention Network website, take the Campus Prevention Network pledge, and then receive access to both the SADI and the 80, as we call them, completely for free. They'll fill it out. We recommend, if you do decide to take it, that you fill it out with a group of key stakeholders in your communities, because obviously some of the questions might be better known by one person than another. There are about 60 questions, 60 to 80 questions, depending on which inventory you're taking. And you fill it out, send it back to us, and we look through your answers. We score it to some degree. You know, it's not like a numerical score, and the goal is not to tell you you're doing bad or good. It's simply to highlight areas that you're doing really well, and then also highlight some additional considerations for where you might improve. We send you a report back that looks at your answers as compared to the best practices that we're measuring them against. And then we also send you a document that looks at your answers as compared to the aggregate of schools that have taken it. At this point, we've got about 100-something schools that have done the alcohol diagnostic and about 120 that have done the sexual assault diagnostic. And schools have found that even just the process of taking the assessment, even if you decide not to submit it, although we definitely encourage you to do so, can be really powerful, especially now that you're familiar with our framework, to look at what kinds of questions do I need to be asking in each domain to know whether or not my efforts are helpful. So thank you for asking that. And happy to provide more information if it's appropriate. Okay. So there was another question on your last slide, the demonstrated impact slide. What was the increase from? This is speaking to a demonstrated impact overall. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I'm happy to go back into our data and look. Really what we're looking at is, was there any impact at all? Obviously, if we see that these numbers are going down, then that's saying our course is not having the intended effect, and we would certainly need to take a look back through those data and figure out how to change that. But the fact that we are seeing positives is something we're really excited about. My colleague, Holly Ryder-Milkovich, who is our resident sexual assault prevention guru, has been spending some time digging a little bit more into this, and she's actually going to be releasing a white paper in the near future that highlights these data in a little bit more detail, particularly some of the trends that we're seeing around student bullying and the experiences that student athletes have from a bullying standpoint. Another question, will these slides be made available? Yes, everyone will be receiving these slides via email. Excellent, great. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for taking the time to join me today. There are a couple of other questions that I do want to respond to. I'm going to send an email, some that I may need additional data on to address, but really enjoyed spending this time with you. If you've found this information useful, which I hope you have, or even if you haven't, please do take the time to, in the spirit of critical processes, take the survey that you're going to receive. we always love to know how we can improve our presentations. I hope to, I'm not sure, but perhaps I'll be seeing some of you next week in New Orleans at our Campus Prevention Network Summit. So for those of you who are attending that, I look forward to seeing you there. Please come and say hello. Safe travels if you are going to that. And for the rest of you, I wish you a happy and healthy day. Thank you so much. Please take care and be well.